Alright. Hello everyone, and thank you for coming to our young adult panel titled Beyond Katniss, Top Tips to Create a Compelling YA Character. Thank you for coming to the ARIA Expo. I noticed a few of you have come from Comic-Con and other things, so thank you for following us, love it. I guess what I'll do to start is just give a little insight on the topic for today, and then I'll have each of our great authors talk about what they do. So, hi, I'm Angelina Singer. I'm a young adult sci-fi romance thriller, coming of age / new adult stuff, sometimes in there too, kind of sprinkled in. Because I love to bridge the gap between like teenagers and that like odd like in between teenagers and like young like older adults, which is new adults. So. Anyway, I have a dystopian trilogy. That's the Upper World series. This is book 1. I also have a cheesy love potion romance, and then I have a time travel coming of age duology. That's book 1 called Forgetting What I Couldn't Remember. So, a little bit about me. I'm on the ARIA board. I'm volunteer coordinating today, so if you saw me running around like a crazy chicken with my head cut off situation all day, that's why. But it's great. I love being part of ARIA and meeting wonderful people, as you see on this panel. I'm going to have them speak in a minute. And I'm just excited to dig into the interesting concepts we have in YA books, because young adult books kind of hit different tones and different attitudes than I think adult books or even like middle grade books. There's something about young adult that kind of blends the best of the adventure of middle grade, but to the deeper emotional content of adult books in a way that kind of bridges the gap between being a child and being older, and kind of all the stuff in between that's tricky or hard. And I'm 25 and I still feel like I'm stuck in that like in between phase. So I think we all kind of relate to that at one point or another. So in addition to being a board member, I'm also a journalist. I'm a freelancer, editing, blogging, and stuff like that. And I play guitar because why not? So aside from all the artsy stuff that I do, including crocheting, which isn't relevant at all, I'm going to open up the panel to my wonderful authors here, and let's just go down the line and introduce yourselves a little bit.
Hi, I'm Swan Taylor. I write in, it's funny you're mentioning the bridging the gap. I write in the gap between middle grade and young adult fiction. Most of my stories are contemporary, but for instance, this one is Nancy Drew Meets the Babysitters Club series, and it's basically a mystery detective story series, and I have 3 books in it already now. And the young adult book I have is called The Winning Ingredient, and I always put sports into all my books for some reason. I'm a marathoner and a runner, so I love putting sports in all my books. So this one has football and baking. There's an Italian-American baker in this. But this one has track, basketball, and I'm trying to figure out what other sports I can stick in there too. I think I had some ice skating in the coming up too. So yeah, I love putting sports in all my books, but I write in that gap. That's really important because that's the gap where kids are learning to explore, they're learning themselves, and it's kind of tough to find this area in a lot of bookstores and libraries because you're sort of straddled between that Harry Potter age where you're really young, but then and you're kind of just starting out learning where you are, and then you just you kind of can't find any books in for an older age group, and kids do read up. So I write in that gap. And personally, I'm also an attorney and a scientist. I started out pre-med, so I've kind of done all sorts of things, and that's about it, I think.
Hey everybody, my name is Tim Baird. I am a resident of Mass, and I like to hike and camp, and I'm a mechanical engineer by day. So you see a lot of that get roped into my YA stories. I have my YA Dragon series, The Dragon of the Whites. It's modern urban fantasy, and I wanted to have something that felt real and took place here in today's world, but throw my own fantasy story into it. I like the YA because you might not be able to tell based on the gray hair in my beard, but I started writing when I was closer to YA, and I grew up reading a lot of like John Green novels and really just love the genre. So I try to appeal to a older kid range where they're confused, they're figuring things out in life, and they maybe clash with their parents a little bit, and I try to put that all in together with Dragons. So, yeah, that's kind of my quick little bio.
I'm DR Perry, and I'm a recovering performance artist. Sort of. My daughter has gotten me back into Comic Cons and cosplay, so this is mine. It's my wheels. I kind of can't go anywhere without it. So, as you might guess, I write characters who are a little bit different in terms of their ability levels, but they still have magic. I write in a revealed world, which means that it's not secret that there's magic. It's just part of life. There are people who can make fireballs and conjure water. There are people who are clairvoyant and can flip over a tarot card and be like, oh my god, you're going to have a terrible day. Like, do something about that. You have people who turn into dragons. Like, it might even be the prom queen turning into a dragon, like on the football field. And speaking of which, there's also sports and various activities that I have them do. And of course, true to what I said at the beginning, yeah, I have an entire series about a girl who's in the drama club at her school. There are a few things that I get to explore with this, because in addition to it not being secret, there are also restrictions on all of the magic and psychic and shifter and fae abilities that there are in my world. So they have to go to school for their talents and for their magic and for their abilities. But again, they also have real life problems. So I've got characters who are neurodiverse, characters with different levels of physical ability, characters who maybe aren't as socially adept as other characters, and in addition to that, folks who are dealing with typical and not so typical high school problems. So, you know, are you getting along with your classmates? Well, no, not really. How do I juggle all of these activities, and can I drop one that my parents want me to do because I'd rather do this? So I like to explore all of these different choices, and that's really what drew me to YA, and the ability to adapt to different situations and different circumstances that might change, and they can change like that. I used to do charity marathons and all kinds of stuff like that. Can't really do that anymore. I'd be at the back of everything. I mean, there's a few that I can do, like the walks, but it's kind of unpredictable whether or not I can in any given day. So I have to adapt to my own level of ability, and I thought, shouldn't there be books about people who have to do that also for kids who love reading fantasy? And not characters whose challenges are negated by the fact that they have magic or have psychic powers or can turn into a bird. So, that's my stuff.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing. I think that's super fun, and I'll bounce off what Tim said. I'm also from Mass, so Aria kind of adopted me as well, so snuck in there. But I'm happy to be here, and I guess we'll go ahead and dive into our questions. After we get through these, we'll get to some Q&A for the audience if there's time. But let's go ahead and start with the basic. So, in your opinion, what draws readers the most toward YA characters? And anybody can just jump in. I guess we'll leave it open to you guys.
Coming of age, I think. Relatable stories that are really, even as adults, we're still changing and evolving. So we're always coming of age, so that both adults and young kids can relate to YA stories and characters.
What drew me to YA is, growing up there was basically your classic literature, and then there were children's books. I felt that there was sort of this gap in a lot of the books that I read that didn't really target teenagers per se, that wasn't super filtered and super censored. Teenagers, it's a very confusing time. They are developing at different ages, different speeds. You might have kids in the same grades who are a little behind, a little forward in their social development. And it's just a super awkward phase where people are going through things that adults are afraid to admit that they're going through. And the younger audience, they haven't experienced it yet. So without having those kind of topics covered explicitly in a book that parents might not want them reading, it's kind of weird for a teenager per se to find representation in a story where they can really identify. And that's one of the things that drew me into seeing a lot of YA novels come out, because they would have stuff that would immediately want to be banned by maybe a certain town that didn't want the children to be exposed to it, but they're just kind of maybe afraid to admit that the kids are really doing these kind of things. So I don't know, you either focus on it or you give them an outlet where they can read about it, express themselves, and maybe help discover who they are. And that's why the YA kind of really drew me in. Especially helped too when I had my own child, because then I became much more children focused about what kind of things can I write that I can have my son read someday that will help him develop and also be excited for him to read and not just be a boring old book that dad wrote. So.
I think that I already said kind of a lot, but I do feel like part of the reason that I continue to write YA is because it's a way for all generations to kind of keep in touch and to remember what it's like to be young. I remember when I was in high school, I felt like the adults around me, they didn't act like they had been there. And I knew they had, logically, because, in order for them to get to be their age, they had to have been through being my age. But it felt like there wasn't very much empathy. So what I like to do is write with that in mind and also fashion my adult characters so that they have some depth. And what I find is that, and my husband said it earlier today, we have kind of two demographics who read my books. First of all, we have kids who are like maybe 12, 13 years old on into like 18 to 20s. And then we have people my age, people who are in their 40s and up, and they're reading it. And either they want to try to remember what it's like, or maybe they want to know how the world has changed since they were that age. And other thing that I hear a lot is, this takes me back. It reminds me that I was young and I was this age, and it's different, and wow, what the kids have to go through nowadays. So I find that I think YA is like this touchstone. It's a bridge. It's not just a bridge between child readers and teen readers and newer adult readers, but it can also be a bridge between generations, because those stories, I feel like they're very emotional and they have the potential to speak to more than one generation.
Yeah, I think your point is really well taken, especially because it is like something that bridges the gap, not only in the reading context, but between generations of like, oh, I understand you better now because I forgot what that was like, or something like that. So I really like that kind of mediator approach. It's very interesting, very well put. To move on to our next question, how about you guys share an example of a YA character you feel stands out in the crowd? Be it one of your own or one that you just read and really admire.
Percy Jackson.
Yes. Yeah.
My daughter is reading Percy Jackson right now, and she has ADHD. And it was just such a transformative experience for her she was reading it, and she puts the book down and she comes running into my office. Mom, he's like me, he has ADHD. And he's not a dog, and he's not a boy writing a comic with his friend, because she'd read Dog Man, she'd read Captain Underpants, and it's like he's more like a real boy. And I'm like, yeah, kiddo, like good, it was important. And then I felt like that's a very important thing. So because I had read it before I gave it to her, and I had a very much of a yes and moment that's from improv in theater. So yes and is when you take something somebody improv and then you run with it and you take it in a new direction, and then you wait for the next person to yes and off of you. So I feel like I'm trying to yes and off of Rick Riordan. And Martha, I was on her blog for my interview, and she asked me a question like, if Rick Riordan asked you to write in his world, what would you do? And I'm like, oh my God, at first I freak out. But, because it's awesome. But he's one of those jump off points for me. And I feel like every author kind of stands on another author's shoulders. And yeah, I read Harry Potter and I read Twilight, and I didn't yes and off of them. But Rick Riordan, yeah, he got me going, he got me excited. So Percy Jackson, absolutely a very different kind of main character than I had read when I was growing up.
I would say I'm kind of wavering between my two main characters in my books, which is Mia, who's in The Winning Ingredient, and Tessa, who's in the Right Detective series. And they're strong, savvy, smart, female protagonists I think are really important in literature today. And what's really important too with young adult literature is that you see that the characters are growing and evolving, and that they are able to sort of explore their worlds, make mistakes freely, and then kind of learn from them and then move on. So it's a transformative process for them. And so these characters, I enjoy writing about them and easily trying to translate that into a learning lesson that's not quite so obvious. But when you were mentioning the thing about, magic and the important, how it was sort of hidden within your books, that's sort of how I feel too with I write contemporary stories, but I do feel that there's magic in the everyday, so that even if they're just going to school or they're hanging out in a treehouse or something, there's something that's special and that they can take from it, and that they can actually become heroes in everyday life. So I think that those characters that are strong and independent really are important in literature. So that's why I write mine. Got it up.
And probably my favorite YA character growing up was the book Hatchet by Gary Paulson. If you haven't read it, it's basically a young man, they crash into a little single-engine airplane in the Canadian wilderness, and the pilot dies without giving too much away. But he is essentially a little kid at the start of the story. He's never really had to do anything. Now he's thrust into the middle of nowhere. He has to survive on his own, and he only has himself to depend on. And I remember reading that and watching the character growth go through the story, where he goes from okay, I'm gonna just kind of make a pile of sticks and I'm gonna sleep under it, to now he's getting food, he's building his own supplies, he's trying to figure out a way to get rescued and get out of that situation. And that was a really important story for me to read when I was younger, because I remember, at the time I'd really gotten into hiking and camping just a couple years before that with my dad, and thinking could I do this? Do I have the skills? Would I be able to have the determination to just give up and die? And you watch this boy go through the process, and that was probably one of my favorites growing up.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think especially when we find stories that have elements of plot elements that we relate to and are interested about, I think it adds a lot to the young adult experience of bringing us back to that place, but also adding nuances that maybe we didn't experience ourselves. So, very, very good point. The next question I want to ask you guys: how do young adult characters differ from characters in more adult books? Is it tone, subject matter, or something else?
I guess I'll go first. So with my character, it's a young man named Liam. He goes through sort of a pretty traumatic event, encountering a dragon up in Maine. And a lot of people just straight up don't believe him. He's only a teenager, he's in high school, but something bad happened, but he doesn't really have any evidence of it because what happened was quickly covered up by the Air Force. So he's telling his parents, he's telling his friends, nobody really believes him, but he has this situation he needs to go down and try to hunt this dragon, bring it to justice, because he keeps seeing things in the news that happen that he knows it's indicative of a dragon attack, but nobody ever finds the dragon, nobody knows. So he's going through this whole thing where he is trying, he's still doing homework, he's still taking tests, he's trying to be friends with his, classmates and everything, but he's also trying to hunt this dragon down all by himself. And the tone basically there is that, nobody believes him, everybody thinks he's just silly, everybody thinks he just had some sort of traumatic event, and he's having PTSD, but there's not really anything going on. Whereas if he was an adult when this happened, people probably would have taken him more seriously. They would have said, this grown man's not going to lie about this. This must have happened. But because he's a teenager, they're like, oh, he's just being silly. He saw a big lizard or something like that, And that's the tone that I get in the books that I like to write, and the books I like to read, where, there's maybe that kind of, oh, you're just a kid, you don't know what you're talking about. And then watching the quote-unquote kid develop and prove themselves and, kind of grow up throughout the story.
So I like to write characters and their families. So I have in Hawthorne Academy, my series that takes place in a Magus high school, and they all have familiars. The headmaster is a space magus, and he has a son who's just starting high school the same year as my main character. His name is Harold. Harold is also a space magus, but his magic doesn't work quite right. Sometimes it doesn't work at all, or it's very weak. He can't move things the amount of distance he should be able to. So they're not sure what's going on. The thing is that Hal is quick to try to adapt to this, and he's quick to sort of think to himself, there's more to life than how strong my magic is, so what if I'm not the strongest magist at the school? My dad's the headmaster, and I see other kids struggling socially. I'm going to reach out to help them. I'm going to be, a person, like a good person instead of worrying about my magic. So Hal just goes and does this. He sees this girl who's starting to go down sort of a mean girl path. She's bitter, she's afraid, she's angry, she comes from not such a great home, and he reaches out to her right in the first book. And she, I think, otherwise might have gone on a very dark path if it hadn't been for him. And his father, his suspicion is that his son has a chronic illness. And instead of doing something about it, he takes his time investigating it. So what I have is the difference between Harold and his father Hector is that Hector is slow, he's methodical, he takes his time, he makes sure about everything before he takes an action. And Hal is just like, no, this needs to be done, I'm gonna do it. So he's quick, he's thinking with his heart, and he's like moving at a faster speed. He thinks to himself, well, this is the time, there's no better time than now. He doesn't need all the facts. He just sees that someone's got a problem and he wants to help. And they're both like that. But it's the difference between the young adult character versus the adult character, and they're in a similar situation. They both see that other students are having problems. But Harold is like, I'm going to go and be a friend. And Hector is like, well, I gotta check this, I gotta make sure their parents don't raise a stink if I try to offer them help. I have to try to wrangle with the board of trustees to see if we can hire a counselor for some of these kids. He's got lists and outlines and plans, and it's just all of this stuff that makes them different. It comes from experience, and experience, I like to show, is, sometimes it's good, it's an asset, it helps you. And other times, it has given you trauma. It has given you pause. It makes you not so ready to help or to make a difference until you're absolutely sure. So that, I think, is the difference between adults and young adults. And when I read adult fiction, a lot of the time, one of the authors I read a lot is Stephen King. A lot of the time, his characters, they wait too long. They don't act until it's almost too late. And some of them pay the price for it. They die and have to sacrifice themselves because he writes hard. But it's a matter of oh no, I need to be sure. I'm doubting myself because I've been proven wrong before. And I find that writing the young adult characters has less of that, and it's fun and refreshing and it's energizing to do too.
When I think about the difference between adult literature and young adult, definitely the characters are younger, of course, but also there's sort of lightness to their reality, at least, in a simplistic form. So they're not dealing with the stresses of everyday adult life, but at the same time, they also have to deal with the fact that they don't control a lot of what they're dealt. So they're given cards, they have to engage in them, but they're not really able to control what that is. So as an author writing that, it's an interesting point to deal with, because you have to sort of take what they get and you have to figure out exactly how they're going to handle a situation as they're learning to engage with their worlds and their friends and their lives, but they don't yet know who they are. So what I usually do is I write a lot of ensemble casts so that their parents aren't necessarily the ones who are solving the problems. It's their friends and their close confidants that are the ones that come in there and sort of help them work through their problems. And that way there's not so much engagement with the adults, and they're able to learn from that. And it's a problem-solving type exercise too. So they're learning to engage with their environment, at the same time also deal with all the problems that they're given, that we give them knowingly every day.
Yeah, I really like your point about how your close friends kind of take, not that they're a parental role, but they take a parental role in the sense that they're the people you go to starting, I would say late middle school years, obviously through high school, you start to like, I have a problem. Who should I talk to? Probably my best friend and not my mom as much. Like, it starts to shift. And I think that's a very good point. And given that you write the gap between middle grade and like young adult books, like that's a really poignant idea that like I experienced. I mean, we all have at least at some level felt like I love my parents, but I don't want to like share this with them. Like, I still do that. I'm like, I'm not gonna share certain things with my parents. Like, we get to this point where we're like, yeah, that's a need to know basis, right? Like, obviously. So, you know, that's a really good addition to the conversation. For our final main question before we open up to Q&A, I want to ask the panel, why do you think it's YA characters that are often chosen to save the world?
The fantasy people are probably good with this one.
I was gonna say, I would say that's because they're not expected to.
Yeah.
Whereas you watch some movie, like think about like Independence Day. You know, Will Smith comes in, he's got the fighter jet. Everybody knows that he's got his finger on
He's
the trigger,
man. Yeah.
and he's gonna save the day.
Yeah.
But you got something like Harry Potter, where all this stuff is happening, and somehow none of the professors are able to handle these situations. You know, yet the kids, quote unquote, figure out like the way in very unorthodox manners, using the limited resources and limited training that they have, and then it's more exciting. You know, like a dumb one, I think it's Chamber of Secrets, maybe when the troll goes into the bathroom or whatever. Any of those professors could have walked in and done any hundreds of spells to get rid of the troll. But instead we're like shoving wands up their nose and like hitting them with stuff. And, you know, that's funny, it's entertaining. And that's what makes it more fun than, you know, if Statham just walked in and just abacadabra the troll. So that's why I think YA characters often are slated to save the world, because if an adult was trying to save the world, it would be like a 10-page short story. Whereas, you know, kids try to do it and it turns into a 300-page story, you know.
They're working through.
Yeah, they're working through it, it's more exciting, they fail more often, they have to recover from the failure. Whereas an adult, you would just expect them to be able to do it correctly and on like the first or second try.
Well, there are adult books where adults save the world. The Stand is an excellent example of this. A group of adults goes off and saves the world from Randall Flagg. And they have to give up a lot to do it, and a lot of sacrifice, and it's grueling and all of this stuff, and it's a totally different kind of story. They know it needs to be done. They don't want to, they're reluctant, they're slow, they move very slowly. And it's a different kind of story. And with YA, it's like the difference between forging a story out of steel and you know, trying to pour quicksilver into this mold of a story. So YA is like the quicksilver. And I feel like when I'm writing a protagonist who saves the world or does some big thing to make a big difference, they're always questioning, they're always asking that question, well, why do I have to do it? Why can't my professor do it? Why can't my older brother or sister do it? A lot of my characters do have, like, some of them have several siblings. And it's like, well, why not? And I always answer that question. Always, because it's not right to, I don't think it's right to leave that question unanswered. Especially if the character in question has to sacrifice a lot. So sometimes the answer is, well, your brothers and sisters are evil. They're not going to do it. So, you know, sorry. Sometimes it's your professors they made a mistake in the past. So they're an example, a living example of the mistake you don't make. You can't make a promise, an unbreakable promise, and still expect to save the world. Another one too is like, here, you are this chosen one. You have this potential for this destiny. And it's like, well, what are you going to do with it? And it's like, well, of course I'm going to save the world. And when you get there, the character says to themselves, wait a minute, this isn't what they told me it was. You mean everybody else who's been chosen to do this just walked away without fixing it? Are you kidding me? Like, realizing you're the first one to make a difference or break a cycle or change a pattern, I think is enormous, and I think that young adult audiences need it, and I think adult audiences need to be reminded of it. That there's a lot to be said for flexibility when it comes to changing the world, and the world is sort of this allegory for your circumstances. So it's really, I think that's why there's so much of that in YA literature, because the readers also feel like everything's life or death right now. Like, oh my God, I can't believe it, I spilled my milk all over my sweater and everybody saw. You know, that's a teenager. Maybe everybody didn't see. Maybe you spilled your milk in the corner and nobody saw, and if you just took your hoodie off really fast and rolled it up in a ball, like no one would know you spilled milk all over the front of yourself. But they think that way. So they think it's life or death. So you have to give your characters these stakes. But again, I'll close with how I begin. You have to give them a reason why. There has to be a reason, and let them question it if you're writing YA.
Well, I think it's inspirational, the idea that you have power to affect great change just being who you are. And so the fact that they're able to do that, sometimes saving the world in a big way or just in their own circle of friends, I think is an important lesson, and it's a powerful one that is really, really impactful to the reader. So I think that's why you see a lot of it in not just fantasy, but contemporary YA fiction.
Yeah, it's true. Teenagers or young adult people have different stakes. I remember being in school and being like, oh my gosh, I can't spill paint on myself. I can't do this. And so it just feels like end of the world. So when you add end of the world, like actual issues, like, oh, the world could actually end, like everything could crumble. Add on top of that teenage angst, it kind of amplifies it like 5 notches up. So it kind of builds on issues that adult books might have, but they make it feel worse, I guess is the best way to put it. I mean, honestly. So
It builds.
it does. It brings a new nuance to it. And I guess some of us are kind of masochistic because we like to remember that feeling of like embarrassment. I don't know why, but maybe it makes our current lives feel a little bit less chaotic because we're like, well, at least I'm not mortified in the middle of the lunchroom.
I think that connects.
Yeah.
It connects your reader to your story,
Yeah.
your characters too,
Sure.
because no one wants a character who's completely perfect and not flawed.
No.
That's not us, and so that's not our own experiences. So if we were writing as writers, we're not actually like writing a perfect life. So yeah, you should have life like me. Now that's usually the character you don't like in the book. so yeah, I like writing those characters that have a little bit of flaw and then a little bit ready to grow.
And, topic for another panel, but flaws can be external. They can be, in the broader scale or smaller scale, or it could be an internal struggle, which, like, I personally really enjoy internal monologue struggles. Like, not that I want to read a whole page of monologue, but I mean, like, the problem is in their own head or their own perception, because you can play with a lot of different kind of, not mind games, but, like, you can have a lot of fun with brainstorming, like, is it really the story or is it how they're perceiving it? Play with reality a little bit. Bring different layers to the experience of the character and the reader by association. So that's all the questions I have. I would love to open it up to our wonderful audience. Ask us anything about young adult books. Maybe it's character, it's a plot point. I only ask you to keep it vague so that it's not just your story and that way everyone can get something out of it. So try to ask something generalized. If you want a little input, we can talk afterwards or something. Yes, please.
Do you guys have any tips and tricks for like maintaining a young person's voice when you're narrating? Like outside of dialogue.
Read it out loud. No, it really, you write it, like write it, and then like what I like to do is I take a chapter out of every installment in one of my series and I devote it to a different character perspective, not the main character's perspective. So to make sure I have their voice right, I will write their chapter and then I'll read it. And if I feel like I'm getting stuck, I'll read it like again and I'll read it out loud. I'll record it and I'll play it back to myself. I don't like listening to my own voice.
Oh, same.
Recovering performance artist. Okay. So, but it is very helpful in making sure you've got that character's voice and if it's consistent. Another thing is if you have somebody who is that age who could read a little passage, then let them read it. It really made a difference that, okay, so I have a friend whose daughter is in high school, so sometimes I'm like, I don't know if I'm getting this person's voice read, so I ask her, would you mind reading like 5 paragraphs of this? And she will. And then she'll be like, this sounds like a grown-up. It's like, okay, so I gotta fix that. Like, this sounds just like the last one you sent me. Okay, I gotta fix that, you know. So get feedback and like, listen to it. Take the advice. I know it can be hard because you like think, oh, I love this turn of phrase. And it's like, I don't ever delete any of that. Here's a secret. They say kill your darlings, and that's what they mean. Delete all those sentences. I never delete it. I put it in a file. I put it in another file. Sometimes I go back to it and I'm like, what was that again? I was describing something about rain, and it didn't fit that character, but maybe it'll fit this one. So I'll go back in that file like, oh yeah, and then I put it in there. And it's like, this is an adult character saying this, so it sounds like a girl.
Yeah.
Yay, win! So just be open-minded, and don't be afraid to ask, and don't be afraid to listen to your own voice reading it out loud. Anybody else?
I would say either via TV or in real life, hang out with young people.
Yeah.
So one of my fun things that my husband and I do when we go out to dinner or lunch or whatever it is well, there are 2 things. One is when I watch like what I think are first dates, and I'm kind of like listening to how they go. And I'm like, I wonder if that's a Tinder thing. And sometimes they go really, really bad. Like you're thinking, oh, stop talking, this isn't going on. And so it's really good for dialogue and for writing later because you think, oh, this is a really bad first date. This is going to be great. But also to young people, when you listen to them, they're talking, they're saying like a lot, and just their animated actions and how they speak, it can really help with voice. But another little writing advice as far as voice is make sure that, especially with your main characters, that you notice when you're looking back on that all your characters have a distinct voice. So you should be able to read a line of dialogue and say, that's me and that's, be able to distinguish one from the other because your reader's reading it in their head and they're going, that's what that person is saying. So you really, really want to have not just distinguishing dialogue tags, features, whatever it is, but you want to have everyone have their own distinct voice.
In terms of maintaining the YA voice, I have it a little easier because I've spent years volunteering with the First Robotics program, and I was on it in high school, and I've been a mentor and volunteering for tournaments. So I'm constantly surrounded every spring by a bunch of teenagers, and it definitely makes me feel like Dr. Evil sometimes when he starts to do Macarena. And, I'm hip, I'm with it. No, so I mean, like you gotta stop every once in a while and think, like, if my high school character is talking about how they just raised the escrow on his mortgage payment so that the city taxes can be covered, you're like, oh, maybe that's not his problem.
Unless it's Artemis Fowl.
No, instead he's worried, do I have $5 to go hang out with my friends because I want to buy a soda and a snack while we're out at the park or something like that, Try to maintain what their problem is, what they're doing, and how they would approach it given the resources and attitude and perspective that they have at that time. And I think both of you mentioned it, definitely read it out loud, because I found that I have audiobooks for about half my books at this point, and there are a lot of things that I wrote that sound great on page, and then when I hear the narrator send me the chapter to review, I'm like, that is the dumbest thing ever. Why did I say it like that? So now before I publish a book, I actually go and just read it to myself out loud. I often record it, put it on like a private YouTube video that I can just listen back to it. Because it definitely sounds different when you hear it come out of your own mouth and verbally, and you're like, oh, change that. That can't be on the page. That's stupid. So yeah, to get a good perspective on it, you want to try to get your head into the perspective of the character, and then hear it and read it and see if it makes sense both ways.
Yeah, I think those are excellent tips. Just to weigh in quickly myself, I would say that Urban Dictionary is your best friend, but don't overuse it. It's funny because I'm young enough that I'm that weird, I was born literally on the end of millennial, so I'm technically Gen Z, but I don't fit in either one because I'm too old for Gen Z and I'm definitely too young for millennial culture. So I think they call it Zillennial. Zillennial? Yeah, I think so. So I don't really know either all that well. But, depending on when you set your book, you want to reflect 90s teenager dialogue, you got to research that. Like, that's a whole different thing than, like, now. I don't really know much about either.
Gnarly, dude.
Yeah, right? So I would say Urban Dictionary. Yeah, like dope, sick, whatever. I still say that, like, whatever.
I had a lot of fist bumping with the guys.
Yeah. But I also was thinking too that we have to think about the context. For example, Dawson's Creek, they all talk they're 45 and they're supposedly 13 or 15, whatever it is. If for some reason you kind of abandon the disbelief when you're watching it, for the first 5 minutes you're like, what kind of Shakespeare crap are they on? But then you kind of get into it and you're like, the whole world, they all talk the same way, so it doesn't feel weird anymore. And I watched the whole series, I loved it, but like, it's so cheesy. Sometimes you're like, oh, that's so cheesy. But, like, it kind of fits. So, depending on the world that you want to build and the culture in that world, you can make your teenagers sound like adults. You just have to be consistent and make everybody, like, react to that same, like, ratio of maturity, I guess. I don't know. So that's my 2 cents. Anybody else have questions? We have a little more time, I think. I don't have a clock, but 20 minutes. Okay, we got some time for questions. Ask us anything. It can be about plot, can be style, tone, attitude, even just concepts, like how we come up with young adult concepts. Yes, please.
One thing I'm trying to work out a young adult idea. It's based on a novel I had pretty much written that involves a flashback where the main character and the romantic interest had met in high school, and they meet again 10 years later. So it involved flashbacks going back to their high school days. And I found out that, after reading it, the flashback material was so interesting to me that I felt like perhaps I could develop a YA concept out of it. And I just wanted, because this is a story, the original story takes place in the late 80s, early 90s, so this would be going back 10 years. I just wonder what challenges you have if you're working in it's almost historical now, when you're going back to a time, something that's set in reality, and going back to a time in your lives. Something historical that you may not have experienced, but perhaps your parents did.
I wrote a duology, and the second book in the duology is YA. It takes place in 1929. And most of the cast, like the main characters, are teenagers. And so it did involve a good deal of research. I hadn't lived through that. I had a historical consultant to help me with certain details, like did they invent Zippo lighters yet? Could one of my characters possibly have one? Things like that. But all of the lingo in that, you can look that up. And when it's from something from further in the past, you can't really rely on Urban Dictionary to tell you what somebody from Northern California might say if something's awesome versus someone from Texas might say when something's awesome in 1982. There are ways to look that stuff up. You can Google it, but also you can do things like watch. And again, like I watch a lot of TV. I don't just read for research. You can watch like Stranger Things, and you can see how they talk there because they've done the research for you. And you can look it up. Like you have a character like Max who's from California. She and Billy, they're both from there, and they talk differently than the rest of the kids in Hawkins. So you can kind of contrast that and maybe see what they might say, how they might talk. And how it might be different from the adults. If you were there, if you were there in the 80s, but you weren't geographically there in the 80s, like you're setting it in a different area or maybe even in a different country, you definitely want to look up, like maybe This Day in History site is a good one. It'll tell you what was going on at that time in that location. I like to use those kind of tools for research when I'm writing outside of the time. I don't write that, even though like my adult characters are certainly old enough to have been around in the 80s. I don't really write that for public consumption. Sometimes I will write a scene that took place between two of the adult characters. Maybe they have a history and I need to hammer it out in my head. Never sees the light of day. So I don't do that kind of research for that, but it's certainly possible too.
She covered most of everything I was going to say. No, that's good. It was very thorough. All I was going to contribute was I saw an example the other day with the new Wednesday series that came out.
Oh
They
yeah, I started
mentioned-
watching that, yeah.
So without giving too much away, they mentioned that she was born on a Friday the 13th and her birthday is coming up on this date. And I watched this person in a blog, or another writer, like tear it apart because they went back and looked through all the calendars and figured out where her birthday would have been on a Friday the 13th based on her mentioning that it was like in a certain month and a certain thing was happening. So if you're going to get super specific, make sure that your info is right. Because, you know, like little things, if your character, if you're having a flashback to, you said it was supposed to be in the 80s and it was going to be a little before then. So if your characters are watching like the Brady Bunch or MASH or something, make sure the episode you describe actually happened when that scene was occurring. Because somebody's going to pick it apart and be like, oh, that episode happened here after, you know, you're describing your writing of that scene. So if you're going to try to be historical, just make sure it's accurate because then it will feel more real to the reader and they're not going to be constantly trying to figure out like, okay, this is the fictional part, this is the historical part. Blend it so hard that it's impossible to escape the scene and it just feels like you're really there.
Yeah, time-wise it works out well for me because my characters, the high school part would be roughly the time that I went to high school. It deals in a little geographical location like Boston where they're adults. I know I've been around much more than Washington, D.C. suburbs where their high school would actually take
If
place.
you're going to Washington, D.C. in the 80s, you really need to look at the current events going on because there's going to be a lot, but with all kinds of stuff that happened. So, yeah,
And this character's father is involved in politics, so
Yeah.
I know I've got to keep an eye out that.
Yeah, it can be tough to get caught, like when you get caught up in those details. I agree that it's important to be consistent and also intentional, like to make it real. But there are also times where like you don't want to spend hours researching kind of plywood that were used in hardwood flooring at the time. Like you got to draw a line somewhere. So you know,
I think you can probably craft the story and then stick in a lot of the details after. Even if, say, you're writing a Victorian novel and you want to know what corsets the person, you know, those kind of things you can stick in later. It's important. The hardest thing, I think, personally, you guys can tell me what you think, when you're writing something that's historical, is being able to connect that with a modern day reader. So you don't want to get too hung up on, you know, living in the 80s, like that's how it was, or I'm reliving my time in the 80s or the 90s or whatever it was, because you might have a younger reader who's thinking, well, I wasn't there, you know, so I'm not going to connect with it. You want to kind of find that happy medium of, you know, here we are now, but let's flash to the past.
Yeah, I think so too. Just past, present, future, just having everything kind of make sense.
You can leave yourself a note too. So one of the things that I like to do is, I need to look it up, right? So I will put an asterisk, research this. And then after I'm done with that chapter or I'm done with a certain amount of segment I need to get done, I will do a find search and I'll put asterisk. And I press find next, and it'll bring me right to the asterisk. I can read the note I left for myself, and I can do the task.
Another thing I was going to add is if you want to make it political in a certain time period, you could always give yourself an out by having a large fictional aspect of it. So like instead of being Washington, D.C. in the 80s, you could always have it be some other made-up town that has a made-up mayor with a made-up selectman board or whatever, because then you could have like the same kind of overarching geopolitical things going on, you know, like Reagan could still be president or whatever, but you're worried about Mayor TBD, who is causing trouble in city XYZ, because then you can kind of flex your muscles and do whatever you want creatively while still being immersed in the real world, where then you can kind of mess with your fictional town a little bit.
Yeah, the town is definitely fictional.
Yeah.
It's just that I think the original reason I included the flashbacks in the original work was how his experiences as a teenager helped create the adult that he was 10 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And helped explain a lot of things.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote my duology. I have time travel coming of age. Basically, my character goes back in time to find her dad who's been missing for almost a decade, and she sees her younger self and her old middle school bullies, and she has to come to terms with the things that she went through and kind of meet herself literally where she's at, like literally, like not figuratively, literally. and kind of how that made her who she is. And it was something that I did, like a healing process for myself, but I've had people really like it just for the fact it's very campy, very exaggerated, very like slapstick, like, you know, guns, tasers, like just goofy, like slapstick violence and stuff, you know. So it's kind of fun because the bullies grow up to be psychotic criminals who force people into a virtual reality world to control them. So there's a lot that kind of goes with it. And in the second book, the character gets stuck in the VR world herself. So I had fun with it. But anyway, that was a long way of saying you can absolutely use elements of your own life. I would caution you if you do use like a real mayor. I think there might be some legalities, I should ask you, with using, like, no, I looked this up. Because like in my first book, I was scared to say Taylor Swift, and I figured out that you actually can say their name. You just can't write their dialogue, essentially. Like you can't be them, but you
don't
can
want to disparage.
Right,
So if
you
you're
don't want to
using-
disparage, yeah.
Yeah.
And you can't really be them, but you can mention them. Like you can mention, oh, this song by Taylor Swift, like, that's fine.
But no lyrics.
No lyrics, yeah. Even song titles I wouldn't really use. If anything, you could imply it. Like I think I read a book, I can't remember who it was, but it was someone that I read. They were very expert at telling you exactly what song they meant without actually using any lyrics or copywritten titles. Just by mentioning maybe an artist, like, oh, that latest hit by, like, I don't know, like Green Day. And you knew, because you can mention a band, you just can't use the content. See? Oh, that one about, you know, questioning, like, authority. Like, okay, American Idiot. Like, you know. So it's easy to do if you know what you're doing.
And if you have to make if you want song lyrics in your work, make your own band. I made a vampire punk band called Night Creatures, and I had
It's dope, I've read
their
it.
lyrics.
It's great.
Their lyrics are right in there. You know, the guy's dad is he's a vampire, but his dad is mortal, and his dad has Alzheimer's disease, and so he wrote a whole song for this battle of bands about his father and you know, remembering his father the way he used to be. So you know, you need moving lyrics like that and stuff. You know, don't paste someone else's lyrics, and you're a writer. You can write it. You know, pick a meter. Make sure that there's some rhymes in it, and brush it up. You know, get somebody's opinion on it. If you know anybody who writes poetry or writes song lyrics, then there you go. Just run it by them. And again, take the feedback seriously. Don't go, oh yeah, thanks, and like just delete all of their comments. That's not cool either. But yeah, there's ways around stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. So a little tangent, but I think we have a little more time for another question or two. Do we know how much time we have?
7 minutes.
Okay, we got about 7 minutes. Yes, please.
So, this is a question for all of you. Do you have any one thing that is most challenging about writing, whether it be the setting or the ending, or maybe even the beginning, or the characters, or a host of characters? Is there any one thing that you find the most challenging when you write? Or does it all just kind of come to you with time?
I guess I'll start this one. I just had a thought. I would honestly say that if we're talking about parts of the story, I usually get lost in the middle. I'll have a general idea of how I want to end things, but sometimes getting there is a little messy, and I do not outline extensively. I'm what they call a planster. I plan a little loose idea, but I don't want a heavy outline because then I'm going to limit myself. I know my brain is going to be too married to it. I won't have room to like expand or grow or have like exciting plot twists. So I don't outline much. I might do some character sketches just kind of get a sense of who's who like a little bit, but even that's like kind of as I go. So the bigger answer to your question for me, I have trouble having the brain power. I'm a freelancer by day. Since I've been starting to do that, like I spend all day reading about like how to install hardwood flooring, how to do this. It's a marketing company that does like all different stuff, and it's so draining despite the fact it's not that creative. So by the time I get to write it, I haven't. Lately, it's been like probably close to a year since I actually wrote something for myself. But you know what, it comes in seasons. I would say to you or anybody else in a similar place, like honor yourself, consume media that inspires you, read other books in your genre. Like for example, I'm reading Cinder by Marissa Meyer right now because my next concept is going to blend like contemporary romance with a hint of like sci-fi. So the publishing house that I'm talking to is like, yeah, you might like that. And I'm like, I don't want to read that anyway, I might as well. So consume media that helps you in the right direction. Be kind to yourself. Listen to music, make a playlist, go on Pinterest. Like there are ways to get the juices flowing. but be kind to yourself in the process, because you know what, I'd rather write something I'm really proud of than crank out something crappy and have to fix it. And that's also why I don't do NaNoWriMo, which is, I know, controversial, but I'd rather not force myself. Anyway, yeah.
Well, I'm a little similar but different than yours. I'm a pantser, so I don't plot anything.
Yeah.
I just sit down with my laptop and I start writing. I usually have a name of my character and, oh, this book's gonna be about this. I don't even plot out my mysteries or my thrillers that I write. So I might write, you know, I have a thriller coming out next year and I didn't know who was gonna be the killer. So I just kind of went with it and figured the killer was gonna tell me.
You too, yeah.
They're gonna tell me eventually which one killed the person.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the fun aspect for me of the first draft, is just kind of discovering the story like my reader would. It's like, oh, it's like I'm reading a new book, 'cause I'm reading. And that's the thing I enjoy most about writing, and to me it's the least stressful part of the whole thing. Editing, on the other hand, I put out 3 books in the novella this year and I'm losing my mind because I just want to write. I don't want to edit anymore. So for me that's really the hardest thing, is just making it, the drafts as perfect as possible, because that's what your reader's going to appreciate. So that's the stress for me for being a writer.
I was gonna say, my hardest part is probably coming up with all the characters, because I tend to world build easily. I'm a heavy plotter, by the way, so I want to start off knowing every character that's going to be in it. I want to know physical and emotional traits of all those characters, but then I can make up the setting, the world as I go. But I really don't like when, at least in my writing, when characters appear out of nowhere halfway through the book. I want there to at least be like allusions to them, and they're mentioned like, oh, you know, Billy's in a class, and then we might not meet Billy till 200 pages later, but I want him to have been sort of established somewhere in the beginning. So I have a really hard time gaining any momentum until I have all, you know, like whether it's 10, 15, whatever characters, you know, are going to be in the story. I have to have all that ironed out. And once I do that, then I can just blaze right through it. But until I create that foundation that I can build upon, I get really hung up on it. I might not write for a couple days because I'm like, oh, I don't know who the antagonist is going to be, and what their hair color is going to be, and what kind of things they like. I have to like totally flesh that out. But the second I'm done, then I just go. So that's sort of like my pain point that I have to work through, is ironing all the characters out first. Then the rest just kind of comes to me as I write.
I listen to all you guys and I'm like, oh, I used to do that. I can't do that anymore. I cannot write the perfect first draft. I cannot sit there and go back and tweak it 5 times before I move on to the next part. I can't afford to. I only have so much energy. I only have so much ability. And there are some days where I have to lay in bed with an eye mask on and an ice pack on my head and dictate into a microphone. So I can't afford it. I can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I need a draft. I have a publisher. I have deadlines. And my draft has to be into the editing team by a certain date, despite all of my health challenges. So because of that, I get the draft out. And as a matter of fact, I have learned to enjoy editing. Because when I get notes back, I have a really great team. This publisher's given me 3 really amazing people to go over my work. And I don't send them something that I've dictated that has a bunch of horrible homonyms. I do go over it when I can sit and look at a lighted screen. But when I can't, I know at least I've gotten my word count in. I've gotten it done. And what I do is I go in with a general idea written on a piece of paper, what needs to happen in this chapter, and which characters are in this chapter. So sometimes your outline is only that. And other times that's all, sometimes that's all the planning you need. Other times you need to leave notes to yourself. And this is why I started leaving notes to myself, because I couldn't go look it up. If I'm laying in bed with a blindfold on to keep the light out so that my migraine is manageable, then I can't go to the computer and Google it. I have to leave a note for myself. So if I can do it, though, the good news is that any of you can. Because I also have a colleague, and she writes from bed all the time. She has cerebral palsy. She cannot get out of her bed. She can't stand unassisted. She also can't sit at a typewriter, and she can't control her hand movements. She dictates. She gave me a lot of tips on dictating. I wouldn't have been able to do it without her. Her name is Mary Crawford, and she writes contemporary romance with protagonists who have all kinds of disabilities. It's like really beautiful books. But anyway, it's, adaptation really I think is the most important thing when it comes to being an author. If you can't get your words down or you can't get your inspiration where you normally find it, you have to be open-minded enough and willing to look elsewhere or try a new technique or ask someone who's in the similar situation as you. Because when you do that, and if you can try a lot of things, it broadens your perspective, it helps you write more, and it also gives your characters depth because you have new perspective.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to close out. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to my wonderful panelists for answering questions and hopefully helping out the audience. If you guys want to chat with us as we're working our way back to the main ballroom, feel free. And thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.